It's Tuesday, the 18th of March. Welcome to the President's Daily Brief. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. All right, let's get briefed. President Trump is set to speak directly with Russian President Putin today, pushing for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. But Russia isn't budging, demanding ironclad guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO as part of any deal. Later in the show, the U.S. ramps up airstrikes on Yemen's Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, keeping the pressure on the group as its sponsors in Tehran vow retaliation. Plus, Venezuela is blasting the White House for the deportation of hundreds of Tren de Aragua gang members, also known as TDA, to El Salvador, calling the move illegal. That's coming, of course, from Nicolas Maduro. We'll examine if the White House actually cares what the despotic Maduro regime says about anything. Okay, look, you and I know that the White House, in fact, doesn't care what Maduro says. In reality, the Venezuelan strongman has stolen more elections than even Putin. And in today's back of the brief, after years of dismissing it as a conspiracy theory, the New York Times is finally acknowledging what many sane people have suspected all along, that a lab accident in China may have been the real origin of COVID-19. And U.S. government officials, worked to suppress the notion of a lab leak during the pandemic. I, for one, am shocked that there's gambling at Rick's. But first, in today's PDB Spotlight. President Trump is set to speak one-on-one with Russian President Putin today, marking the most direct effort yet to get Putin on board with a ceasefire in Ukraine. It's a high-stakes move because while Ukraine and the U.S. signed off on a 30-day ceasefire during talks in Saudi Arabia last week, Russia hasn't budged from its maximalist position. And last time we checked, a ceasefire only works if both sides stop shooting. Speaking with reporters aboard Air Force One, Trump said he and Putin would discuss, quote, dividing up certain assets. And that would include land and, curiously, power plants. Now, one assumes that the Ukrainians would also want to say in divvying up Ukrainian assets. When referencing power plants, Trump didn't elaborate on what exactly that means, but most likely he was referring to the massive Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Yeah, it's the largest power plant in Europe and is currently sitting, smack in the middle of Russian-occupied Ukraine. Trump appeared to be somewhat optimistic ahead of the phone call, telling reporters, quote, we want to see if we can bring that war to an end. Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but I think we have a very good chance, end quote. But here's the problem. Putin has shown no interest, that would be zero interest, in a ceasefire unless it locks in Russia's gains from the war. He's been clear about his priorities. He'll keep the land that he's taken, and he'll shut the door on Ukraine ever joining NATO. Deputy Russian Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko reinforced that message, telling Russian media that the Kremlin will demand, quote, ironclad security guarantees, meaning that Kyiv would be permanently excluded from NATO and Ukraine would have to agree to total neutrality. And it's not just about land or alliances. Grushko also made it clear that Russia wants no foreign troops, not even peacekeepers, on Ukrainian soil as part of any post-war deal. That could be a sticking point because both Britain and France have floated the idea of sending forces to monitor any ceasefire. So, you ask yourself, what does all this mean for Ukraine? Well, it's not great. And by that I mean it's the opposite of great. And as we've been reporting here on the PDB, Ukraine's position is frankly weakening by the day. They've now been all but completely pushed out of the small foothold they had in Russia's Kursk region. That's a position that, at its peak last August, covered some 500 square miles of Russian territory. It was a massive propaganda win at the time and a potential point of leverage to at least have a card to bring to the negotiating table. Now, that's been whittled down to a tiny sliver on the border. The fighting there is less about holding land at this point and more about survival, preventing Russia breaking through and pushing deeper into Ukraine's Sumy region. That would open up a whole new front in the war, something that Ukrainian forces, which are already stretched thin, can hardly afford. So, with Ukraine losing ground and Russia unwilling to negotiate without major concessions, you ask yourself, again, you keep asking yourself questions, what can Trump actually offer Putin to get him on board? And that's the big question heading into today's call. Because right now, Russia appears to hold all the cards, and Putin seems to be well aware of his hand. We'll keep a close eye on what comes out of this conversation today, but frankly, don't expect any breakthroughs, at least not without Ukraine making some painful compromises. All right, coming up after the break, the U.S. steps up airstrikes on Yemen's Houthis as Iran vows retaliation. And Venezuela slams the White House for deporting TDA gang members to El Salvador. Now, to be fair, Venezuela's Maduro went to a lot of trouble to export his TDA criminals to the U.S., and now he probably feels like all that work went for nothing. I'll be right back. Welcome back to the PDB. The U.S. has launched another wave of airstrikes on Yemen, hammering Houthi terrorist positions in response to renewed threats against shipping vessels in the Red Sea. Monday's strikes hit key locations in the Red Sea port city of Hodeidah and the Al Juf governorate, that's north of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. According to the Associated Press, the death toll has climbed to at least 53 people and around 100 injured. The airstrikes are an extension of military actions that began over the weekend under President Trump, who authorized the largest U.S. military operation in the Middle East since taking office. The strikes come on the heels of the interception of roughly a dozen Houthi drones on Sunday, which the U.S. military says were targeting the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier strike group in the Red Sea. A U.S. official told Reuters that none of the drones came close to the Truman before being shot down, and U.S. forces also tracked a missile that splashed down off the coast of Yemen. The Iran-backed Houthi leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, has vowed retaliation against U.S. ships if the strikes continue, warning, quote, "If they continue their aggression, we will continue the escalation." Now, the terror group has also threatened to resume attacks on Israeli-linked vessels, though no such strikes have yet materialized. A Houthi military spokesman, without providing any evidence, claimed the Iran-backed terror group launched a second attack on the Truman strike group. Amid the growing escalation, U.S. air defense stockpiles are being rapidly depleted to counter Houthi drone and missile barrages, raising concerns about the sustainability of interception efforts. The Pentagon maintains that its latest operations aim to, quote, "defend American interests, deter enemies, and restore freedom of navigation." A U.S. official told Reuters that the air campaign could extend for weeks as Washington simultaneously tightens economic pressure on Iran while seeking leverage in nuclear negotiations. In a post on Truth Social, Trump escalated his rhetoric against the Iranian regime, posting, quote, "Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran," end quote. The president accused the mullahs and their Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, of, quote, "dictating every move by the Houthis and fueling their terror attacks with weapons and funding and intelligence." Well, he's not wrong. Iran predictably dismissed U.S. claims that it directly controls Houthi military operations. Iranian state media continue to insist that the Houthis act independently. In response to the U.S. airstrikes, IRGC General Hossein Salami warned that Tehran would respond, quote, "decisively and destructively to any perceived threats from Washington." As regional tensions intensify, analysts warn that continued U.S. airstrikes could backfire, bolstering the Houthis' resolve rather than degrading their capabilities. You see, despite relentless Saudi-led bombardment during Yemen's civil war, the terror group has demonstrated impressive resilience, embedding itself further into regional power struggles. Okay, turning now to the intensifying fallout from President Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, which triggered a legal standoff in the U.S., as Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro blasts the mass deportation of TDA gang members to El Salvador. As we reported Monday on the PDB, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a wartime law granting the president broad authority to detain or expel foreign nationals from enemy nations with minimal due process. Now, the law has remained dormant for more than 80 years. It was last used during World War II to justify the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, Trump's executive order is bringing it back to life, specifically targeting Venezuelan nationals aged 14 and older on allegations of TDA gang affiliations. Maduro's regime wasted no time in denouncing the deportations, framing them as, quote, kidnapping of 14-year-old children, end quote. His outrage, however, well, it does kind of ring hollow against the backdrop of his regime's well-documented political crackdowns, arbitrary detentions, election thefts, and state-sanctioned violence against any dissenters. Seeking regional backing, though, Maduro appealed to the community of Latin American and Caribbean states to formally condemn Trump's move, setting the stage for a broader geopolitical standoff. Meanwhile, El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, confirmed early Sunday that the 238 TDA deportees arrived in the country and were immediately transferred to a high-security terrorism detention center. We also learned from the Associated Press, citing an internal memo, that Washington paid San Salvador $6 million for the arrangement, money that also covered the deportation of 23 MS-13 gang members. Back in the U.S., the legal pushback was swift. Just hours after deportation flights departed, a federal judge in Washington issued an emergency order halting further removals and ordering any airborne flights to return. The Justice Department, however, countered that the ruling came too late, as deportees had already left American airspace. The administration's response to the judicial order has been anything but conciliatory. Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, openly defied the ruling in a Fox News interview Monday, calling the deportation policy a, quote, game changer. He vowed defiantly that deportation flights would continue daily, regardless of judicial or political pushback. Homan stated, quote, we are going to make this country safe again, before doubling down and stating also, we are not stopping. I don't care what the judges think. I don't care what the left thinks, end quote. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was equally unyielding, dismissing the judge's ruling as having, quote, no lawful basis, and signaling that the administration is prepared to escalate the legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, the White House is standing firm on its hardline stance, urging illegal immigrants to, quote, self-deport. As the legal and political firestorm intensifies, this confrontation is shaping up to be a defining test of executive power, judicial oversight, and the limits of immigration enforcement in the United States, not to mention the ability of a trial judge to interfere with U.S. foreign policy and national security actions. Regardless, with an overall approval rating hovering somewhere around 27% or so, that's just above the basement level, the lowest in decades, might we add, the Democrats find themselves having to explain to the public why they are fighting for the rights of criminal gang members operating in the U.S. illegally. While they obviously oppose anything coming out of the Trump White House, well, they might want to think about the optics and perhaps be a little more careful about picking their battles. All right, coming up in the back of the brief. After years of dismissing it as a conspiracy theory, the New York Times is finally admitting that a lab accident in China may have been the real origin of COVID-19. Imagine that. I'll be right back. In today's back of the brief, well, it only took, 5 years? But it looks like the New York Times is finally ready to acknowledge the possible true origins of COVID-19. In a new opinion piece, columnist Zeynep Tufekci lays out a damning case that the so-called consensus on the virus's origins wasn't just wrong, it was actively manipulated. Tufekci highlights how in early 2020, the lab leak theory was dismissed as a conspiracy, remember that? Despite real concerns about the Wuhan Institute of Virology's research. She writes, to promote the appearance of consensus, some officials and scientists hid or understated crucial facts, misled at least one reporter, orchestrated campaigns of supposedly independent voices, and even compared notes about how to hide their communications in order to keep the public from hearing the whole story, end quote. Now, that's not just scientific debate, that's a coordinated effort to control the narrative, to manipulate the narrative. She points to the now infamous Nature Medicine paper from March 2020, which ruled out a lab leak. But internal communications later revealed that some of its authors actually believed a lab leak was likely. One of them, evolutionary biologist Christian Anderson, wrote privately, "The lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario," end quote. And yet, in public, he and his colleagues insisted the opposite. Why? Well, according to Tufekci, they sought guidance from Jeremy Farrar, who's now the chief scientist at the World Health Organization. Farrar even suggested they revise their paper to more forcefully rule out a lab leak. And then there's the Lancet letter, which dismissed the lab leak theory as a conspiracy. Turns out, that letter was secretly organized by Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth Alliance, the same nonprofit that funneled U.S. grant money to the Wuhan lab for risky virus research. Daszak even strategized on how to hide his involvement. Tufekci also points to newly surfaced communications from Dr. Anthony Fauci's senior advisor, David Morenz, who wrote in an email, quote, "We're all smart enough to know to never have smoking guns, and if we did, we wouldn't put them in emails, and if we found them, we'd delete them," end quote. Oh my, well, how about that? That sounds an awful lot like an admission of a cover-up. So what now? Tufekci argues that we still haven't learned our lesson. Scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology are still conducting dangerous research on bat coronaviruses under questionable safety protocols. She concludes, "We may not know exactly how the COVID pandemic started, but if research activities were involved, that would mean 2 out of the last 4 or 5 pandemics were caused by our own scientific mishaps. Let's not make it a third," end quote. All right, well, it's swell that the New York Times has decided to run an op-ed of this sort, but it's 5 years after Elvis has left the building. And it falls seriously short of the New York Times using their extensive resources to do what used to be referred to as, what did they call it? Oh, serious investigative journalism. I mean, developing actual human sources, digging through mountains of paper to uncover just how complicit the Chinese regime under Xi Jinping was in covering up the origins of the pandemic. You'd think the Times would consider that effort newsworthy. I mean, if for no other reason than perhaps scoring another Pulitzer. The Chinese regime has basically received a free pass over the years. The global community failed to demand transparency from them, and there was never any hope that Xi's government would on its own offer up serious cooperation or assistance in understanding what happened. It may sound like I'm simply talking about history now. I'm just rehashing what happened in the past, but I'm actually talking about the future. There is no doubt that we'll have another global pandemic, and our response is going to be less effective to the next pandemic because the Chinese regime failed to open up the Wuhan lab to the scientific community to understand everything possible about the origins and early days of COVID-19. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Tuesday, the 18th of March. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And to listen to the show ad-free, well, I suspect you know what to do. Become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief simply by visiting pdbpremium.com. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.